12 interceptor missiles fired in a single minute over Kuwait cost the United States taxpayer more than the entire annual budget of the US Postal Service. That is not a metaphor. That is the arithmetic of Operation Epic Fury, a war that is billing itself to America's economy in ways no evening news broadcast has fully tallied. The real number being discussed in closed rooms on Capitol Hill is not the $1 billion a day you have heard reported. There is a figure so large that even some of Trump's closest allies in the House called it shocking. And buried inside that figure is a question no economist has yet answered. At what point does the bill for this war become the recession? The answer is closer than anyone in Washington is admitting. Stay with this, because what comes next is not speculation. It is arithmetic. The first fighter jet was still burning in Kuwaiti airspace when oil traders in London pushed Brent crude past $100 a barrel. That happened on the morning of February 28, 2026, within hours of the joint US-Israeli strike campaign that the Pentagon named Operation Epic Fury. 3 US fighter jets had been shot down in what officials described as a friendly fire incident. Though the details remained unclear, the price of crude had been $72 the day before. In the span of a single trading session, it climbed more than 40%. What the oil traders understood before most Americans did was this: the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, surrounded on 3 sides by Iranian territory, had effectively closed. Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels. Insurers invoked 72-hour cancellation clauses, as they are allowed to do in a conflict zone, and then reset premiums at 4 to 5 times their previous levels. Tanker captains diverted, traffic slowed to a near halt, and with it roughly 20% of the world's oil supply and 20% of the world's liquid natural gas stopped moving. The head of the International Energy Agency described what followed as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not a phrase used lightly by an institution that has tracked every oil crisis since the 1970s. Here is the thread this script will pull, and it will not be resolved until the very end. The Pentagon has asked the White House to approve a budget request of more than $200 billion to fund this war. That request sits in the hands of a Congress that has already passed the largest military budget in American history, and inside that request is a document that almost no one outside the Pentagon has fully read. What is in it may determine whether the United States economy tips into recession before the end of 2026. The direct cost of the war in its first week exceeded $11 billion, according to figures Pentagon officials shared with Congress. The Center for Strategic and International Studies calculated that the first 100 hours alone burned through $3.7 billion, driven in large part by the cost of the interceptor missiles used to shoot down Iranian drones and ballistic missiles. Patriot interceptors, the most modern version, cost over $4 million each. THAAD interceptors, the system used to stop incoming ballistic missiles from high altitude, had not received new deliveries since August 2023. Deliveries were not expected to resume until April 2027. The weapons being used to fight this war are being consumed faster than the factories that make them can replace them. That is not an accusation. It is a supply chain fact cited directly by defense analysts at CSIS. And it raises a question that the dollar figures alone do not answer. What is the cost of a war you are fighting? With inventory you cannot fully restock. By the 12th day, the cumulative cost had risen to an estimated $16.5 billion. Analysts at CSIS projected that cost would continue growing by roughly $500 million every day, absent a significant change in the pace of operations. The Penn-Wharton budget model, run by economist Kent Smetters, put the range for a 2-month campaign at between $40 and $95 billion in direct military cost alone. That range expands dramatically if American ground troops enter Iran. The scenario of the Trump administration has neither confirmed nor ruled out. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, when asked directly about the $200 billion supplemental request, confirmed it was real. He then said the number could move higher. His words, "It takes money to kill bad guys." The The supplemental request lands on top of the $839 billion defense bill Congress already passed for fiscal year 2026, described at the time as the largest military budget in American history. If the supplemental is approved, direct military spending this year will exceed $1 trillion. Trump has also requested a $1.5 trillion defense budget for fiscal year 2027, a 50% increase over current levels. The White House Office of Management and Budget objected to the $200 billion supplemental in internal discussions, calling it too large. Some senior administration officials do not believe it has any realistic chance of passing Congress. Here is what that means in practical terms for the American economy. Since October 7, 2023, the United States has provided Israel with $21.7 billion in military aid, according to Brown University's Costs of War research project. Add the cost of U.S. operations in Yemen, Iran, and the wider region, which totaled between $9.6 and $12 billion before Operation Epic Fury even began, and total U.S. spending tied to the post-October 7 conflict had already reached between $31 and $33 billion before the current war started. That number has been climbing every day since February 28. Lindsay Kolskarian, program director of the National Priorities Project, told CNN that the Iraq War, which began with similar cost projections, eventually cost the United States close to $3 trillion in direct spending. Brown University's Costs of War project, accounting for veterans' care, interest on debt, and long-term obligations, puts the full Iraq price tag above $8 trillion. Former Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz told Congress in 2002 that Iraqi oil revenues would pay for reconstruction. They did not. The gap between what wars are projected to cost and what they actually cost has a documented history, and that history runs in one direction, but the war's economic reach extends far beyond the Pentagon's budget line. This is where the story gets heavier. Roughly 20% of global crude oil and oil products normally flow through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. In 2025, that amounted to around 20 million barrels of crude. About 80% of Asia's oil imports pass through that same waterway. Japan sources roughly 90% of its crude from the Middle East, most of it through Hormuz. South Korea gets about 70% of its crude from the region and routes more than 95% of that through the strait. South Korea activated a 100 trillion won market stabilization program, equivalent to roughly $68 billion, in response to the war's economic fallout. China imported around 40% of its oil from the Middle East before the war. Beijing had stockpiled crude in advance, and China's strategic and commercial reserves gave it a buffer. Iran also reportedly allowed Chinese vessels to continue passing through the strait while blocking others. An Iranian official told CNN that Iran was weighing a policy of allowing cargoes priced in Chinese yuan to transit Hormuz freely, a move that would shift energy trade away from the US dollar. That detail has received almost no attention in American financial media. Hold it. For American consumers, the damage arrives in a more direct form. Brent crude, the global oil price benchmark, rose roughly 15% in the opening days of the conflict and then surged to $120 a barrel as the fighting deepened. US oil prices briefly spiked to $119 a barrel on the Monday, following the opening strikes, the highest since before the pandemic years. Gasoline prices at the pump followed. The U.S. Postal Service announced an 8% temporary postage surcharge to offset growing transportation costs. Airlines added fuel surcharges and raised ticket prices. Goldman Sachs economists raised their 2026 U.S. inflation forecast by 0.8 of a percentage point. They cut their GDP growth forecast by 0.3 of a point. And they raised their recession probability for 2026 by 5 percentage points to 25%. In a more extreme scenario, oil averaging $110 through April, they modeled inflation at 3.3% and growth at 2.1%. EY-Parthenon's chief economist Gregory Dacko told CBS News his firm sees a 40% chance of a severe economic downturn over the next 12 months. That figure was up from 35% before February 28. PNC Financial Services chief economist Gus Faucher put it plainly. If oil rises to $150 a barrel, the odds of recession top 50%. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario in which oil averages $140 for 2 months. They called it the breaking point for the world economy. Former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen warned publicly that depending on how the war affects oil markets, economic growth will suffer and the Federal Reserve's ability to contain inflation will become harder. The Federal Reserve had been preparing to cut rates. Now those cuts are on hold. The European Central Bank postponed its own planned rate reductions on March 19th and raised its 2026 inflation forecast. Economists warned that energy-heavy European industries face a high risk of technical recession if the maritime blockade continues through the summer. The economic architecture of this moment contains a contradiction that the World Economic Forum named directly. The United States has imposed enormous costs on many of the same economies it relies on as trading and strategic partners. The damage to allied economies complicates the coalition politics that will be needed to end the war and stabilize what comes after it. Iran, unable to match the US and Israel in the air, is spreading the cost of the war across the global economy by targeting energy infrastructure, shipping lanes, and commercial facilities across the Gulf. The logic is deliberate: raise the price of escalation until the pressure for negotiation becomes irresistible. Now return to the document no one has fully read. The $200 billion Pentagon supplemental request is not primarily a request to cover what has already been spent. Most of that money is earmarked to urgently rebuild weapons stockpiles, to restock the Patriot interceptors, the THAAD systems, the precision munitions that have been consumed at a rate the existing industrial base cannot sustain. CSIS noted that the Army anticipates delivery of only 172 Patriot missiles in the entire current fiscal year. The rate of consumption in the first weeks of Operation Epic Fury alone far exceeded that figure. Defense Secretary Hegseth boasted publicly that companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon were building at levels they had never seen before. That is true. It is also the economic signal hiding inside the military one. A wartime industrial expansion of this scale, funded by debt at a moment when the national debt has surpassed $39 trillion, does not flow freely into the civilian economy. It competes with it. It pulls engineers, materials, and capital toward weapons production and away from the roads, hospitals, schools, and energy grids that generate civilian economic growth. Brown University's Costs of War project calculated that military spending produces an average of 5 jobs per $1 million invested. The same $1 million spent on education creates nearly 13 jobs. On healthcare, 9. On infrastructure, 7 to 8. The trade-off is not abstract. Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, signed into law in July 2025, cut $1 trillion from Medicaid over a decade. It cut $536 billion from Medicare. It cut $186 billion from food assistance, the largest cut to food aid in American history. The fiscal year 2026 budget cut domestic spending by 22.6%. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was cut by 44%. The Centers for Disease Control lost 44% of its budget. The National Institutes of Health lost $18 billion. Within 24 hours of the administration confirming its $200 billion war request, the U.S. Postmaster General testified to Congress that the Postal Service could run out of operating cash by October. David Kelly, chief global strategist at J.P. Morgan Asset Management, called the combination of job losses and surging gas prices a very nasty 1-2 punch for the economy. The U.S. economy had already added just 116,000 jobs for all of 2025, the lowest annual figure outside a recession since 2002. The economy had lost jobs in 5 of the 9 months preceding the war. The question planted at the start of this script was not whether the United States can afford to fight this war. It has a $1 trillion defense apparatus. It can fight. The question was whether fighting it tips the economy into recession. The honest answer as of today is that economists at Goldman Sachs, EY-Parthenon, the Penn-Wharton budget model, and Capital Economics all say the probability has materially risen. The threshold numbers are known. Oil at $125 per barrel for a sustained period. Gas at $4.25 a gallon. Inflation heating above 4%. Consumer spending, which drives 2/3 of the entire US economy, pulling back because families cannot absorb the rising cost of fuel, food, and freight all at once. And tucked inside the story about Chinese yuan-priced oil transiting Hormuz is something that may matter more in 10 years than anything else happening right now. The US dollar's role as the world's dominant currency for oil trade has been one of the foundations of American economic power since the 1970s. Every time a barrel of oil is priced in dollars anywhere in the world, there is demand for dollars. That demand is part of what allows the United States to borrow cheaply, run deficits, and fund wars. If the Strait's effective closure begins routing energy trade toward currencies other than the dollar, long-run consequences for American borrowing costs, and therefore for the bill that comes due on $39 trillion of national debt, could dwarf anything being discussed in the current supplemental fight. No one in Washington is saying this out loud. That is perhaps the most expensive silence in the room.